But this heat creates very high stresses on the rock and on the canisters themselves. The canisters, if you talk about spent nuclear fuel, are in the Swedish design supposed to be covered with copper because it has a very, very low corrosion rate in the absence of oxygen. So when you close the repository and seal it up, the oxygen is meant to disappear rather quickly, and then the corrosion of copper is supposed to slow down and take a very, very long time. But these corrosion rates have been disputed, and that issue is not yet resolved. So experts in Sweden have disputed the safety case and have argued that to get the same level of risk as the nuclear waste disposal company is claiming, instead of 5 centimetres of copper, you would need a metre of copper. So they're talking about quite a big argument in terms of how they see the corrosion rates. Steel, if you're talking about high-level waste, for example in France, which also reprocesses, they're planning to have steel around their blocks of glass high-level waste, vitrified high-level waste. But steel corrodes much faster, and it also generates hydrogen when it corrodes. So that means you've got gas, which you've got to think about what's going to happen to the gas inside the repository, and I'll say more about that later. The heat can damage the sealing of the backfill around the canisters. So there's a lot of research that's suggesting that the properties of clay that hold the canisters in place and so on can be severely damaged by high heat. And that's why the Swedes say, well, we have to have them far enough apart to limit the temperature to 100 degrees. But that's another area of dispute where some scientists think the temperature needs to be much lower than that. You also get microbes at depth. So when the original idea of deep disposal was proposed, people thought microbes didn't live in those kind of temperatures and that kind of heat and couldn't withstand radiation. Now we know that they can, and that they can also damage some of the properties of the clay and the concrete underground. Any cement that's in the repository can create a chemical disturbance. So it changes the chemical conditions underground into alkaline conditions, and those conditions can degrade the clay that you're planning to put there to hold the spent nuclear fuel in place. A far field, we're talking about further away from the waste, you have a lot more complex problems. So you have the possibility of the build-up of gas, which can damage the repository, or the release of gas, which can push radioactive water out once the repository begins to leak, or which can itself be radioactive. So the gas can create fast routes for radionuclides to escape, and the processes by which that might happen are very complex to try to predict with computer models. So all the computer models that they use assume that the repository fills with water when it's closed, and that you will get dissolved radionuclides in that water being transported to the surface. And the point of doing this kind of computer modelling is try to work out how long that's going to take. But you can have fast routes also in damaged zones. So when you excavate, of course you damage the surrounding rock, and potentially you can create new fast routes. And you also have very complex chemistry. So another concern that's been raised is about substances called colloids. So milk is an example of a colloid, where you've got little particles of fat suspended in water. Clay also forms colloids, and those colloids can be a fast route for substances such as plutonium to stick, if you like, to the clay particles and to be transported more quickly out of the repository. I'm going to emphasise just a couple of the issues to do with heat-generating wastes, because these are new issues for West Cumbria. The Nirex plan did not include heat-generating waste, but they introduced a number of significant potential harms that therefore have not been considered here in West Cumbria. So one is the effect on the rock. This is a computer modelling paper. I've taken this figure from the evidence by Professor Stuart Hazeldine to the consultation here, but the original figure comes from a scientific paper. It's not specific to this area or to the proposal here, but it just gives you an idea of the kind of uplift you can expect in crystalline rock just due to the heat of the waste. So that's showing an 85 centimetre uplift at the surface, which can obviously make a significant difference to anything buried underground and put enormous amount of pressure on any canisters or any measures taken to control the wastes. Another issue with heat, other than its potential effects on the backfill and so on, is how that can affect the water flows underground. You all know that heat flows upwards. So if you heat liquid, if you heat water underground, it's going to move much more quickly towards the surface. And this is an example again from Professor Hazeltine's evidence, where he shows a computer model with that happening, where the red spot is supposed to be the waste buried deep underground, and you can see that the liquid is moving much more quickly to the surface because of that heat than you would expect if no heat was there. Other issues are human intrusion, so the search for resources such as oil or minerals or storage space underground can lead to an explosive release of the repository contents. So people often talk about intrusion, but they often don't realise that you can get the same effect as with discovering an oil well in a movie. You can get an explosive release of those contents up into the air. Earthquakes. You obviously do get earthquakes here in West Cumbria, although not on a massive scale. Even small earthquakes can affect the water flows underground and push water up to the surface, as well as potentially damaging any caverns or shafts. And if we look longer into the future, there's huge uncertainties about things like glaciation. So future glaciations are expected to occur during the lifetime of a repository, and they are expected to pose significant challenges to keeping that waste safe, because the pressure of the ice drives water further down underground, and then if the ice moves off again, that water will tend to come back to the surface. And obviously that pressure can also damage the structures underground. There are some overarching issues, firstly about the role of computer models and the unknowns and uncertainties. So there are often many different ways in which you can try and represent what's happening in the real world on a computer. And it's therefore quite easy to come up with a computer model that looks very convincing and that shows a site is safe, when other assumptions and other ways of modelling can show that it's unsafe. So you can have disputed models, and you can have bias in terms of who's writing that and what they're going to predict. And types of bias are well known, well studied in the literature. They can include confirmation bias, that scientists tend to think that they want to confirm what they thought originally about a site, so they interpret all the data in the same way. And rescue bias, which is a kind of rescuing your theory. So it's assuming that you were right originally and that new evidence tends to be ignored. There are also issues about site selection, which I'm going to say much more about in a minute, and whether a geologically suitable site exists, and issues about costs, because some of the uncertainties I've highlighted could be addressed by changes. You can make the copper thicker, you can make the repository deeper, you can space the spent nuclear fuel further apart, but all those decisions would have serious cost implications if you make those kind of design changes. Does that mean you could have significant radiological releases from the repository? Well, yes, you could have much faster rates of corrosion of copper or steel than are predicted, either because of the new reaction which is being proposed in Sweden by the critical scientists. There might be a different way of copper corroding that hadn't even been thought of before, or by effects, for example, of radiation. So high levels of radiation do speed up the corrosion of steel. You could have a situation where the heat significantly damages the physical or chemical properties of the backfill, which is intended to trap some of the more dangerous radionuclides like the plutonium isotopes. You can have gas pressure damaging barriers or forcing fast routes for radionuclide escape. You can have poorly understood chemical effects such as the colloids I mentioned. You can have fractures, faults and excavation or heat damage, all providing fast routes for escape. You can have damage from glaciations and earthquakes, human intrusion or human error.